So welcome everybody. We're getting to the end of the day. Really happy to be here. My name is Alex Kontur. I'm with the Office of the National Coordinator for Health Information Technology, which we fortunately abbreviate to ONC because it's a mouthful. I'm going to be talking about some of the policy work that we've been doing lately. And so it's a little bit different than some of the other presentations you probably heard here today. I'm not a developer. I am a regulator, so fortunately or unfortunately, depending on your perspective on things. And so we're going to be talking about some of the drivers in the healthcare space that are kind of our reason for being here, trying to learn a little bit more about some of these identity management solutions and tools and technologies that we can hopefully implement as we drive innovation in healthcare. And the reason I say drive innovation in healthcare is because, as you all probably know, healthcare industry is probably a good 10 or 15 years behind, maybe not that much, where a lot of other industries are today in terms of technology use, cool things like APIs, which I'll talk a lot about today. And when I say technology use, I mostly am referring to exchanging and accessing healthcare data, not necessarily the cool medical technologies that save lives. I also want to put in a plug. We're going to have a follow-on session to this at 10:30 on Thursday. Unfortunately, I don't remember the room, but some of my colleagues and other folks in this space will be talking a little bit more about the in-depth technical standards, identity management stuff that we're working on. So just really quickly at a very, very high level, identity is really important in healthcare for a couple of reasons, both on the patient side of things and the healthcare provider or doctor side of things. First and foremost, this idea of consumer access to health information. We're all going to hit the healthcare system at some point, and if you're like anything like me and a lot of other people out there, you're going to want access to information that's gathered about you so that you can make the best, most appropriate decisions for your care and your health. So knowing who I am when I try to go about accessing that information is super important because it's critical to ensuring privacy and trust in that information, making sure that there's no unauthorized access to my information so that the things that I consider private don't get out there into the rest of the world. Finally, there's this idea of record management. Most patients over the course of their lifetime will go to a lot of different doctors. They might hit different hospitals, other provider organizations, and so their identity is often fragmented across these different spaces. And so we need to have good identity management solutions so we can manage records, relate them to the appropriate person, and then make them available when and where they're needed. The provider side of this, we're talking a lot about health information exchange and care coordination, this idea of sharing patients' health data between providers so that, if I'm going from a primary care physician to a specialist, they have a sort of sense of where I'm coming from, the diagnosis that brought me in, my current medications, all that sort of thing. So it's really important for providers to know who one another are so that they can do this sort of exchange and communication and coordination. And then again, on the authorization, authentication, access control side, this relates back to this privacy and trust piece. You don't want the inappropriate people looking at your private medical information. So ONC as an organization, we're under the Department of Health and Human Services. And as I said at the outset, we're primarily a regulatory body. And specifically, we are regulating electronic health record software. And basically, back in 2009, the stimulus bill put a whole bunch of money into the system to encourage the adoption of electronic health records, EHRs. And I'd say we did a pretty good job of that because if you go to the doctor now, chances are they're probably typing away on a computer next to the exam table. And so we've got fairly robust adoption of electronic health records, but we encountered a situation, maybe in retrospect foreseeable, where we've got different systems now that don't talk to one another. And so we've created a bunch of silos where electronic health record system A doesn't talk to system B, and so it's really difficult to share information between them. And so a lot of our activity since 2009, and since we got good adoption of electronic health records, is focused on this interoperability problem. And so some of the things I'm going to talk about today are really trying to drive at solving this interoperability problem. And the first thing I'm going to talk about is a new rule that we've proposed. If you're familiar with the federal rulemaking process, everything kind of comes out as a proposed rule first, and the public is able to comment on that rule, provide feedback, suggestions, things that we did right, things that we did wrong. We read every single comment. We respond to just about every single comment, sometimes categories of comments. And then we go back and publish a final rule. So the rule I'm about to talk about is still in this proposed phase, which means that my hands are tied when it comes to things I'm allowed to talk about. I can't interpret or clarify, and nothing, if we have time for it, that you guys tell me about the rule. If you've read it, probably not. I can't take any of that under advisement when I go back to work on Thursday or whenever. And we work on addressing some of these comments and updating the rule. And also, everything I talk about today is subject to change because this is a proposed rule, and based on comments, it will be changed. So the driving force behind this is something called the 21st Century Cures Act, which really was, in addition to doing some stuff around drug development, research, Congress specifically wanted to tackle this issue of interoperability. And so there's a bunch of provisions in this act, this law, that give us work to do. And so we have this electronic health record certification program where we basically say what's in an electronic health record so that providers who adopt these systems can essentially receive incentive payments or face penalties under Medicare if they don't adopt them. And it's also a broader program in the sense that we want there to be certain capabilities and functionalities in the electronic systems that we're using in the healthcare space. And so we certify. And I'm not really going to run through these. This is just a real quick overview of some of the things that make up an electronic health record. Some of the stuff that we've updated, changed, revised, it's all part of this rulemaking process, something that we've done a number of times before. And as the program continues to evolve, we will probably do again. But the real meat here that I wanted to talk about is that we're finally moving to the 21st century with respect to implementation of some common technologies, APIs. And basically, the 21st Century Cures Act calls on us to essentially require electronic health records to implement APIs to make the data that they encompass accessible, open, exchangeable, and usable by pretty much anybody who needs access to it, particularly the patient. And so what we've gone ahead and done is we've created a new certification criteria for electronic health records software that defines what these APIs should look like. And we're using a standard that's pretty new in the healthcare space called Fast Healthcare Interoperability Resources, or FHIR, to do that. FHIR is basically mostly a data model, but also an API definition. So it's a data model that basically takes concepts in healthcare, like patients and practitioners, turns them into objects, so JSON objects or XML objects, and then we can exchange those objects over an application programming interface, an API, so that we have access to the data that we need. I'm going to step back a little bit and talk about the broader policy context here, because in addition to these API criteria, the 21st Century Cures Act called for a whole lot more stuff. One of the things that it addressed is this concept of information blocking. So in essence, what this is organizations compete around ownership of health data. They see it as a competitive asset and not something that should be freely shared, because the theory goes, if you share health information too much, your patients will walk away and they'll go get care at a better place. But that's really not good for the patients themselves, who have data locked into organizations and they can't necessarily get it out and share it with a provider at a different health system, different hospital, different doctor, what have you. And so basically Congress said, this is no good anymore. You guys can't do this. All electronic health information has to be exchangeable, usable, and accessible. And if you don't do that, then you're going to face penalties, monetary, financial penalties. And so we were tasked with creating exceptions, reasonable exceptions to that rule. So things like if the patient says they don't want to share it, you don't have to share it. Or if there are security implications or patient safety implications to sharing information, you're technically, as proposed, allowed to, I guess, block the exchange of that information. The other thing that's new in the Cures rule is it gave us the ability to regulate the developers themselves. So previously, the certification program focused specifically on the health record technology, the software, and to advance the openness, transparency, competitiveness of the industry, we were given the opportunity to actually regulate the business practices of health IT software developers that come into our program with technology that they want certified. And so really this is with respect to the API piece of this, which I'll get into a little bit later, there's three specific things, conditions of certification associated with the API criteria for the technology itself that basically say that developers have to meet certain transparency standards, certain standards around the fees that they're allowed to charge for API use, and some other standards associated with openness and competition. And then also to maintain their certification, they also have to meet some other obligations, some other business practices. And then finally, there's the criteria themselves, which basically define what this API is and some of the surrounding pieces of it, including some of the identity management components. This slide, there's a lot of information on here. I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail, but the basic premise behind this is that it's kind of twofold. One, it's to remind everybody that in healthcare right now, if you visited a doctor, chances are, if you've accessed your health information, you've probably done so through what is called a patient portal. So your doctor will give you a login, password, or code when you sign up, or your insurer will. And basically, all information that's kind of contained in their silo might pass to your portal so you can see your lab results or your medications or your diagnoses or those sort of things. But it's the way things are today, information from outside the scope of their domain doesn't usually enter your portal. So you're really getting a fragmented look at your own health history. And then you've got to remember all these logins and passwords and all that sort of stuff every time you transition providers and want to get a new look at your information. The other piece here is that APIs are kind of scary to a lot of people in healthcare, which is generally a risk-averse industry. And so as we're going about and trying to change things, there's a lot of concerns about security and privacy. We know that healthcare is a very privacy and security-focused industry. And so really this is just trying to showcase how the stuff that we're requiring on the API side is not wholly different than the stuff that's already required to implement and provide a patient portal. Another slide here, another very dense slide that I'm not going to go into a terrible amount of detail. Basically, these are the different standards that we've proposed requiring around these APIs. The most important one to note, probably, well, a couple of the most important ones to note is this use of FHIR, which I mentioned before, which is the API definition and the content that we're talking about. Also, you'll see that we're trying to leverage some of the identification, authorization, authentication technologies that have emerged and that are used in other industries like OpenID Connect. And so this smart application launch framework implementation guide basically is providing instructions for the use of OAuth and OpenID Connect for launching applications in the context of either an electronic health record system, so within the system itself, so for the provider side of things, or to have standalone applications connect to electronic health records, make use of those APIs, and enable patients to pull down their health records so they can manage them on their phones or whatever personal device that they have. Real quickly, there's a couple other criteria in this rule related to authentication. We do have a whole privacy and security framework when it comes to these criteria. I'm not going to go into detail here, but if you want more information, you can always check out healthit.gov. I briefly just wanted to touch on this idea of the conditions and maintenance of certification again. So these are the conditions on the developer's business practices rather than the software itself. And for the API ones, again, we've got conditions around transparency. So that's just making documentation open and accessible. We've got conditions around fees. So we want developers to be able to obtain a return on investment for the innovation and the development work that they're putting into developing these APIs. But we also want to make them as open and accessible as possible. So there's some guardrails around the fees that they're permitted to charge. And then again, making sure that everything's open and competitive. And also, fortunately, making sure that entities know where to go to access these APIs. So as an ongoing condition, you have to publish the service URLs for your APIs. All electronic health record developers will have to do that if they're certified to these conditions. All right, so I'm going to switch gears and hopefully really quickly go through something else that we're doing, which is kind of trying to attack the interoperability problem from a different angle, and that's the Trusted Exchange Framework and Common Agreement, or TEFCA. So right now in the healthcare space, to the extent that organizations are exchanging health information, it's usually done on a pretty fragmented basis. So we've got these organizations called health information exchanges, which are basically, in most cases, regional or state-based networks that kind of play intermediary or middleman and enable you to send health information from one provider to another. But the issue with these is that they're fragmented again, right? So if you live in a state that has a good health information exchange, you might be able to get good access to data about patients you care for, but not all states have them. Not all states have very robust ones. And if you have patients in another state, for example, you're probably going to have to join multiple networks to get access to their information. So that's not a very good situation for anybody involved. And then there's a lot of different rules across these different networks. So related to things like their data use policies, what purposes you can exchange for, their privacy and security controls, things like that. And so because this is so fragmented, one of the things that we were also directed to do by the Cures Act was try to create a common set of terms and conditions to enable network-to-network information exchange. And so that's TEFCA. So our goals here, and unfortunately my little graphics aren't showing up, to provide a single on-ramp to nationwide interoperability so that I can join any network and get access to all the other networks, essentially. So that electronic health information follows the patient when and where it's needed, and also that the patients can access their information because that's super critical and probably the thing that's going to have the most impact really on transforming the healthcare system and bending the cost curve. And then finally, do this at a scalable national way so that we're not just covering a certain region or collection of states, but really trying to support nationwide access. So the common agreement itself is comprised of a couple different parts. The minimum required terms and conditions, or MRTCs, are so when we looked at the legal agreements for networks that exist today, these are kind of the gaps that we found in them. And so we decided that we're going to try to standardize across those gaps and address them and make sure that things like data use policies are consistent across networks. And so we came up with a set of mandatory minimum terms and conditions that organizations will have to implement. We're also going to award a cooperative agreement, sort of a grant, but a little bit more hands-on, to an organization to kind of manage this overall network of networks that we're creating. And so they're going to have the opportunity to create additional required terms and conditions that entities will have to abide by when they sign the common agreement. And then finally, there's this idea that the QHIN, or Qualified Health Information Network technical framework, which provides functional requirements and standards to ensure that the networks in the network of networks can exchange information in a consistent fashion. So at a very high level, this is kind of how we envision things working. We've got what's called the recognized coordinating entity who's providing the oversight. We've got a bunch of different networks that are should be in existence today. That's the idea, is that These are all health information networks that exist today and that we're trying to connect them together. And then each of these networks has members or participants. Those participants have members, so you could think like, kind of hard to do if you guys don't know the examples, but a QHIN might be a large, I don't know, network that covers a specific region. That network might have different hospital members participating in it. And then those hospitals might have like individual doctors' offices. And so it kind of cascades down. And of course, individuals, people like you and I, can connect at potentially any one of these levels to obtain access to our health information. So missing a couple graphics, unfortunately, but the idea here is that we're trying to standardize the reasons for exchange. And so these are all primarily drawn from HIPAA. So if you're at all familiar with the healthcare space, you've heard of HIPAA. It's essentially the rule that protects the privacy and security of health information. And it determines a certain number of purposes that we can disclose health information for. And so these are the different exchange purposes that we'd expect to see in this TEFCA-enabled network. And essentially what has to happen is any participant in the network, if they receive a request for one of these exchange purposes, they're required to make available any data that they have, any electronic health information that they have related to this purpose. The really important one to note here is individual access services, which is our way of talking about the HIPAA right of access for patients to obtain a copy of their health information or direct their health information to a third party, such as an application of their choosing. Couple different ways to exchange data envisioned under the TEFCA network. We've got two different types of basically query. One that says, I know where the data is, I want to find it, can you give it to me? Another one that says, I don't really know where the data is, anybody who has data, please send it to me. And then a form of push, so I have data, I'm going to send it to you. This slide very quickly just talks about sort of how this all relates. We're not trying to really change the law related to healthcare, so we're not tackling HIPAA. We're not trying to change HIPAA. We're not trying to change state law, any of that sort of thing. So in most cases, entities have to defer to applicable law, which is your state, federal, local laws, and then it kind of flows down. I'm going to skip this one because I'm running out of time. This one as well. Okay, identity proofing. So once this network of networks is up and operational, we're going to need to have confidence in the identity of the participants that are involved. And so there's a legal requirement for everybody to participate that you have to identity proof anybody coming in before you can issue access credentials. And so this is based on the NIST standards, 863-3, and specifically for identity proofing, we're talking about proofing at IAL2. And then we also have to deal with user authentication. So this doesn't happen every, well, identity proofing only happens when you get your credentials from any of the different levels. Authentication has to happen every time you try to access or use the network services, so trying to obtain data or send data. And this also adheres to the NIST standards and is required a minimum of AAL2. And then in my last minute, I just want to touch on one last thing that we're doing, which is called the Fire at Scale Task Force. This is related again to that FHIR standard I was talking about before. So we are aware that as we transition to a more API-centric way of doing things in healthcare, that a lot of the stuff that we used to do before is going to break. And so we've already got systems set up, particularly between providers and payers, around claims adjudication, something called prior authorization, so authorization for healthcare services. And we've got millions and millions of transactions flowing between providers and payers every single day. And they're not being done over, for the most part, these types of APIs that we're trying to implement. And so Also, because the FHIR standard I talked about is relatively new, it hasn't been widely implemented at scale. And so this group is really trying to look at certain use cases in the healthcare system and enable them at scale using this FHIR standard and API technology. So again, you'll see that there's 10 use cases, things that are happening today. And core and essential to pretty much all of these use cases are a few things, two of which are pretty relevant today: authentication and authorization, and patient and provider identity management. So we've got specific Tiger teams that are kind of going out and looking at these things and trying to develop solutions, talk about some of the issues. This is really all ongoing work, so I don't have any specific information to share other than what they're trying to do. But if you are interested in getting involved in this space, I believe that there is a link on the first slide I showed that gives you some information about how to get more involved. We're really looking for experts like you to kind of contribute ideas and solutions in this space so that we can really advance this for everybody. And so I am out of time. Thank you so much. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow up. Any questions, comments, I'd be happy to talk. Thanks.